The 1972 Munich Olympics was supposed to be Germany's redemption arc, since the last time they hosted was when a guy named Adolf was in charge. But this joyous, worldwide Olympic-sized dream quickly became a nightmare as one of the most infamous events in the game's history. Long-stemming tensions between Palestine and Israel boiled over on September 5, 1972, when a group of armed terrorists broke into the Olympic Village and took Israeli coaches and athletes hostage. It was the subject of the 2005 Eric Bana-led historical drama Munich, where the hostage situation and its bloody aftermath were depicted on the big screen. But Hollywood tends to embellish things, and it can be difficult to determine what actually happened on that fateful day. So, today we're marathoning the true story of the Munich Olympics. But before we go for the gold, make sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. Then let us know in the comments what other Olympic incidents you want to know about. For now, it's time to turn back the clock. Picture this. You're West Germany. You're hosting the 1972 Olympics. The last time this happened was in 1936, when the Games were dubbed the Nazi Olympics for an extremely literal reason. The heat is on for Munich to significantly distinguish itself from those regretful times, as well as the Soviet-backed East Germans. In the interest of fostering a light and friendly vibe to the Games, security was purposely more lax and unobtrusive. This fact did not go unnoticed by members of the Israeli delegation, nor their families, who all feared they could be the target of an attack. A threat to Team Israel was apparently confirmed by German officials 3 weeks prior to the events of September 5th, but was never acted on, setting the stage for the violence to come. Week 1 of the 1972 Munich Olympics went off without a hitch, and even garnered some legendary winners, such as the Soviet Union women's gymnastic team taking the gold home to the motherland. And American swimmer Mark Spitz won a record-breaking 7 gold medals and a spot on Wheaties cereal boxes all across the USA. But Spitz's victory was only hot news for a few hours before chaos erupted. In the early hours of September 5th, 8 members of the Palestinian militant group Black September disguised themselves in ski masks and snuck into the Olympic Village with one destination in mind: the rooms where the Israeli delegation were sleeping. Black September had ties to Fatah, who, in turn, was part of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, whose ultimate goal was to eliminate Israel to establish a Palestinian state. They figured the best way to go about that was to commit acts of terror and violence against Israeli, American, and European targets, whom they viewed as the architects of their oppression. And a good way to get the most eyes on their issue was to invade the most watched sporting event in the world. Once the terrorists figured out which apartments the Israeli delegation was staying in, they attempted to force their way inside. Wrestling judge Josef Gutfreund attempted to block the door, while weightlifting coach Tuvia Sokolovsky leapt barefoot out the bedroom window to escape. 2 members of the delegation, weightlifter Joseph Romano and wrestling coach Moshe Weinberg, attempted to fight back against the terrorists, but were ultimately shot as an example to the rest of the team not to try any more heroics. By the time Black September took control of the apartments, they had taken 9 athletes and coaches as hostages. Approximately 30 minutes after the launch of the attack, the terrorists released their list of demands. The hostages were being used to ransom the release of 328 Palestinians and non-Arabs imprisoned in Israel, including 2 German militants, Andreas Bader and Ulrike Meinhof. Authorities were given 4 hours to decide on their response, or else hostages would start being eliminated one by one, with a final deadline of 9:00 a.m. One big problem with the terrorist demands dictated to the West German officials was that they had no jurisdiction in Israel, and thus could not release any of the prisoners. And when they contacted Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, she declined to release any, citing the effect such an action would have on the safety of her people. It was feared they would be subjected to future attacks if this one proved fruitful for Black September. West German officials struggled to negotiate further without Israel accommodating the demands. Instead, Germany offered large sums of money in place of prisoner release. All the terrorists had to do was name their price, but they weren't interested in money. The price remained the more than 200 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for the 9 hostages. While negotiations had technically failed, the terrorists did agree to push the deadline a few hours. This gave authorities the time to clandestinely orchestrate a number of unsuccessful rescue attempts. However, with somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 Olympic reporters and several TV crews filming at the time, any attempts to save the hostages were being watched in real time by the terrorists. The Games were forgotten for the moment when the hostage situation took the main stage to around 1 billion people watching all over the world. the terrorists had indeed gotten the coverage they wanted. With Israel standing firm on its policy of no negotiating with terrorists, the prisoner release was simply never going to happen, barring some kind of miraculous change of heart. However, negotiators did manage to get the militants to agree to a deal. The terrorists agreed to leave the Olympic Village with the hostages to board a plane destined for Cairo, Egypt, where they would continue negotiations. Escaping with their lives, a free trip to Egypt, and the hostages seemed like a pretty sweet deal. The terrorists hadn't secured the release of any prisoners, but in their minds, they had brought attention to their cause and could continue negotiations, plus they had very few other options. So Black September accepted. Here's the deal about the whole plane to Egypt deal the West German authorities offered. It was a ruse, which you probably already guessed if you've ever seen a movie. German authorities never planned on letting the terrorists walk away scot-free to transport hostages to another country. Instead, authorities would be stationed just out of sight around the airbase in order to ambush the militants and free the hostages. It was their last chance, but things went terribly wrong. When dropped into a tense life-or-death situation, most people like to think they'd be Rambo, heroically eliminating the bad guys and saving the day. But in reality, that is a tough thing to do, especially if you have to improvise. And at that time, German law enforcement, like other law enforcement agencies around the world, was not equipped or trained for counterterrorism or tactical policing. It wasn't even an idea at the time. So, for starters, the German officers assigned as sharpshooters had no sniper training, nor any special equipment, including telescopic lenses or night vision. They didn't even have armored vests to protect the small amount of manpower they deployed, for an operation that probably should have had more personnel. And the policemen who were to pose as pilots and crew members scuttled their plan at the last second for its implausibility and tactical disadvantages. This left the plane suspiciously empty. At 10 p.m., over 18 hours since the hostages were initially taken, Black September moved their captives into waiting helicopters, which flew them to Fürstenfeldbruck Air Base. Once they arrived, two of the hostage takers scoped out the plane, where they discovered no pilots, a crucial component to their whole escape plan. Smelling trouble, the two headed back to the helicopters where authorities were waiting. Police fired at the terrorists, who returned fire, kicking off a volley that was chaotically repeated until after midnight. The shootout was a disastrous tragedy. The authorities' attempt to dispatch the 8 terrorists and save the 9 hostages failed. Some of the terrorists used their final moments to eliminate the hostages, some by gunfire, others from a grenade detonated inside one of the helicopters. When the dust had settled, the terrorists had slain 8 hostages, while a 9th died of smoke inhalation. Meanwhile, 5 of the terrorists were slain and 1 German police officer lost his life. A few days later, on 8 September 1972, when the dust had settled from the whole ordeal, Israel decided to take military action. They attacked bases by air and ground in Syria and Lebanon in retaliatory attacks, aiming for targets allegedly associated with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Israel's revenge bombing was successful in vanquishing around 200 PLO militants across 10 bases. 11 civilians were also killed in the air raids. The grim fact that all of the hostages lost their lives indicated that something had gone very, very wrong with the rescue operation, leading West Germany to open an inquiry about it. Their report was organized around 3 topics: security measures at the Olympics, negotiations with terrorists, and the rescue attempts. The West German report concluded that although there were issues based on the terrorists' intent, Israel's refusal to release prisoners, and operational conditions, there was no way to avoid the situation, and no disciplinary actions or removals happened based on the report. Case closed. And officials locked down all the documents associated with the crisis and called it a day. The lack of transparency caused many to point the finger toward a cover-up on West Germany's part, claiming that authorities had known about the planned attack but ignored the warnings. The families of the victims spent years chasing down information and justice from West Germany, until they finally reached a settlement in 2022, 50 years after the attack. Germany launched a new investigation into the massacre and paid a total of 28 million euros to the victims' family members. In a somewhat controversial move, the Olympic Games resumed just a few hours after the hostages were taken in the Olympic Village. Jeez, can you imagine having to focus on pole vaulting while that was going on? And to make matters worse, International Olympic Committee IOC President Avery Brundage had wanted the hostages removed from the village so they wouldn't detract from the games. Real compassionate, Brundage. However, IOC officials made the call and adjusted the course. The games were paused for 24 hours in honor of the victims. But only 24 hours. Officials stood firm that the terrorism should not defeat the Olympic spirit and the games should continue. So what do you think? Should the games have continued or been postponed? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.